Welcome, everyone, to Color Commentary. We are your popper commentators, Michael Pedrick and Adrian Garzales. How's it going, Adrian?
I think you know the answer to that one, Mike.
Is it pretty good?
It is pretty good.
All right. Let's take care of the upkeep, and we can get into our discussion for the day. So first off, this show is brought to you in part by Original Magic Art. Original Magic Art is a web store with all kinds of dice bags, playmats, tokens, and art prints featuring not only art from the world of Magic, but art from the world at large, and also non-Magic art from Magic artists. They also produce a set of metal tokens that you can purchase called Relics of Wizardry that are pretty darn neat. And yeah, if you want to check them out, we are an affiliate, so you can use the affiliate code Commontary, spelled exactly as it is in the name of the show, in all caps, and that'll get you 5% off. We also get a little bit of a kickback from that. So not only are you getting cheaper product, we're also getting, you know, a nice little kickback, and you're helping keep the lights on here. So it's a win-win.
Putting my kids through school.
Putting our non-existent children through school. All right, Adrian, what do you have for us?
Well, speaking of giving us money, we have a Patreon for just $1 an episode. You too can hear the full show, including the pre and post shows, and you get access to our Patreon exclusive Discord channel where it's never a dull moment. The other thing I'd like to talk about is our other show, Common Area, was a huge success. Thank you, everybody. I want to let you know we heard your feedback, and by the time you listen to this, we should just be mere days from publishing our next Common Area episode.
Yeah, we've heard feedback on the axes of we'd like some sort of an overlay, we'd like some sort of deck list at the beginning or end of the episode.
Mike will be working hard on all that.
Yeah, I'm going to be putting together some visual assets to make it a little bit more visually appealing. We did note that there was some glare on the first video. I believe that's been fixed, Adrian.
So here's the thing. In all honesty, we recorded all the videos you're going to see in one sitting, and I believe that in the later ones we fixed the glare issue a little bit. But bear in mind that when you watch the next episode, it is not. It is a continuation of the one you just saw in recording time. Like you're waiting a couple weeks to see it, but we did it immediately afterwards. So you know, a lot of the feedback that you gave us about the actual recording itself won't be fixed until the next time that we produce some of those videos.
Yeah, and obviously, you know, bear with us. This is a new venture. We're still figuring out exactly how we want everything to work, but we were pretty happy with the first episode, and we hope that you folks at home enjoyed it as well. All right, do we want to get into the topic for today?
Yeah, let's get into the topic for today, Mike. And what is the topic for today? It's the yin. It's the yang.
It is a little bit. So I wanted to talk because, and this is something that I kind of noticed looking back on some of our old episodes. We've mentioned in passing quite a bit the white-black Pestilence deck. We've even done deck techs of it. And we kind of wanted to break down this deck and its lineage and sort of some of the historical examples of it. Because this is a deck that, as I mentioned to Adrian, I was playing in... When was it when like the Pats group really started up? Like 2014, I want to say?
I don't know if it was that long ago, but it was a while ago. I guess it was that long ago.
I mean, it was at least 20. It couldn't have been later than 2015. So
yeah,
it's been going for a while, and it's a deck that has kind of come into its own lately. It's gotten a couple of new additions, and I think it's now actually bloomed into an actual like meta deck. It's not tier 1, but it still has legs enough. It shows up routinely in the 5.0 lists, and it's got some interesting lateral choices in terms of how exactly you want to tech this list out. And Adrian, you actually found kind of a weird origin on this deck. Do you want to share that with the folks at home?
Yeah, I'll definitely talk about it. Oh man, I just had it up too. Basically, Wizards published... Oh, here it is. Wizards published a theme deck with 4 copies of a black-white Pestilence deck called The Plague. And it was 4 copies of Pestilence, and then a bunch of things to help protect yourself from Pestilence, like 2 copies of Urza's armor to prevent damage from Pestilence, or Rumen of Protection Black. just goofy stuff like that, so that you could use Pestilence without actually getting hurt by Pestilence. And so even back then, even in a themed product, like Wizards were trying to sell the fact, hey, Pestilence, strong card, but how can we reduce the downside? And I know Pestilence is a little bit older than Urza's block, obviously. It's an alpha card, so it's not like the card hadn't been around for a while already, because it goes back to the very first sets in Magic. But I think that's the first time maybe they released like an actual theme deck around it, so it's just kind of interesting.
Yeah, and for those folks who have not been in Magic as long as we have, the theme decks used to be 60 card, no sideboard decks that Wizards released that were, I think you got something like 2 or 3 rares in them. They were not great, but they were meant as sort of an entry point to Standard.
It was always Jitte had one.
Yes.
Was an intro pack. Notably.
They had a handful that were slightly more powerful than others, but by and large, they were kind of underpowered decks that, you wouldn't see your dual lands. You wouldn't see generally the big money cards out of a set. There are, the occasional slip up, but yeah. And looking through this list, you can even see, and we'll link this down below, you can even see kind of like the beginnings of a synergy similar to what some of the current lists are doing with Guardian of the Guild Pact, in the form of things like Disciple of Grace, which is a 1/2 for 1 and a white with protection from black, or Wall of Junk that's just an 0/7 and sticks around pretty much through any Pestilence activations. In like Voice of Grace, which is a 4-mana 2/2 flyer, protection from black. So you're kind of starting to see similar things in the black-white Pestilence decks of today in Pauper, where you run some amount of creatures that are going to survive most of your Pestilence activations, while also running light life gain. Although I've got to say, Lone Missionary is head and shoulders above Silent Attendant, a 3-mana 0/2 that taps to gain 1 life. But, time goes on and cards get better.
There are greater things on heaven and earth than are thought of in your philosophy, Michael.
Where's that quote sourced from there, buddy?
Othello, maybe?
Huh. Intriguing. All right. So first off, I found a very, very old user-submitted deck on MTG Goldfish that I did want to touch upon, that is actually a mono black deck. So this is submitted in 2016, and we're not going to cover all these lists super in depth, but it runs some interesting choices. So it's got, in terms of creatures, it's got Disowned Ancestor, which is a black for an 0/4, but it can Outlast, which is 1 and a black, tap it, put a +1/+1 counter on it, activate it only as a sorcery. And then it also has things like Wall of Tanglecord, which is a 2-mana 0/6. And also things like Butcher Ghoul and Sultai Emissary, which when they die, replace themselves. And then at the top of the curve, it's got Grey Merchant to kind of finish things off. Now, looking at this list, Adrian, this is sort of a very, very early version of this kind of deck. And notably, it is mono black. So I guess what lessons can be learned from this besides not playing Duress in your main deck?
Sorry, I'm reading all these cards. I can't really comprehend some of them. It's again, it just looks like it's trying to negate some of the downsides. This list strikes me as pretty hateful. Honestly, 4 copies of Wrench Mine, 2 copies of Duress, 4 copies Beckon Apparition. It really had a lot of hand disruption going on. It had a bunch of really terrible creatures that ended in Grey Merchant. And then it ran Pestilence.
Yeah, I mean, it's not the best, but it is sort of a older list in the great scheme of things. And I think the big thing that kind of brought this deck to the forefront is the printing of low on the curve options for this deck. So some of the more recent lists kind of point towards some of the additions that you're seeing in these types of lists. So I've got this list pulled up here from a little over a month ago, and the things I'd like to focus on here, so it's got 4 copies of Thraben Inspector, and I think that the printing of this card helped out a lot of these white X strategies, just in terms of upping the consistency and having an early drop to help combat more aggressive plans such as Stompy, and also providing something that'll live through 1 Pestilence activation in this list. Are there any other sort of high points on this particular list that you think are worth calling out?
Yeah, absolutely. You'll notice it has Custody Squire, which is useful if your Pestilence ever hits the bin, which it can quite naturally, not necessarily getting destroyed. I do kind of like this Shrieking Grotesque card. 2 and a white gets you a 2-1 with flying. If you spin black, the target player discards a card. That's kind of cool. Notably has 3 copies of Crypt Rats as well, but this is also a deck that's playing 4 copies of Grim Harvest, so it probably wants to rely a lot more on creature recursion than just using Pestilence.
And notably, while Grim Harvest is a 4 copies in this deck, I think part of that is just the fact that this deck is missing out on the card draw that you typically see accompanying Grim Harvest, because Grim Harvest is not great in multiples. You preferably want to hit 1 or 2 of them over the course of a game and not much more than that.
I think you'll also notice it's the same person, it looks like, playing this deck a whole bunch.
Yeah, it's got its devoted followers in terms of just grinding leagues with it. But this kind of shows, and we're also seeing like a very sort of slimmed down removal package in the form of Chainer's Edicts and Doom Blades, and kind of compensating for that with the Crypt Rats, and also just kind of trying to end the game pretty quickly for a control deck. Like, it's got evasive threats in the form of Core Skyfisher and Custody Squire, and can also leverage both Crypt Rats and Pestilence as sort of a fireball effect, just dumping all of your mana into it and killing them. So I don't know. This one's definitely an interesting one, and it almost has enough of a varied enchantments package that you could potentially run Oromancer in here, but I still think that Custody Squire is just a much better option for this type of deck. I do love the Aven Rift Watchers. Aven Rift Watcher is 2 and a white for a 2/3 with flying with Vanishing 3, so it comes in with 3 counters on it, and every upkeep you remove 1, and when you remove the last one, you sacrifice it. But it also has the caveat, the ETB effect of when it enters the battlefield or leaves the battlefield, you gain 2 life. So a little bit of a combo.
It's pretty useful in a lot of matchups.
Yeah, and then this deck's also running, Kami of False Hope, the white Spore Frog, so that it can sort of blunt that early aggression that some decks are going to present it with, and even in the late game kind of lock things up with Grim Harvest in theory. Like a 6 mana Infinite Fog is not the worst place to find yourself in if the game's getting a little grindy. I do also want to touch on one of the sideboard cards, the holy grail of hand hate spells, Castigate. And we have talked about this card multiple times on the show. Is this card good now? Did I miss a memo?
I mean, how good is black white? Like, I don't think it's that good.
I think even with black white being a more respectable sort of color combination in this day and age, I still am not a big fan of having to hit both of your colors on turn 2 for this to be, the best it can be. I'd almost prefer to have Duress, even though it doesn't hit creatures. Castigate just seems like the difference between this being cast on turn 2 and turn 3, I feel, is a lot more than some people realize. Like, on turn 2, this is, obviously pretty nutty, but turn 3, that could be the turn after Stompy has deployed the big things it cares about. So I don't know. I'm still kind of lukewarm on this list. And notably, this version is not playing any Guardians of the Guild Pact. And what are your thoughts on that?
I think it's just based, it's more of like a value-based deck where each one of these has some sort of ETB effect or rebuys an ETB effect.
So you're thinking that this list is kind of counting on getting that Grim Harvest online so that it can start reusing these?
And
so
not even that, but I just think it wants to get a little bit more value out of its creatures than just a 2/3 beater.
That's fair. That's fair. I mean, it is a 2/3 unblockable beater in a lot of situations, which does make it a little bit more useful. But and then I'm not really seeing a ton of super spicy stuff in the sideboard, but. And we can kind of move on from this because we did have another take on this list, and this is the ever spicy version of it. That one of the things that it tosses in addition to the already standard stuff like Thraben Inspector, this one eschews the plan of fogging your opponent forever and replaces it with Guardian of the Guild Pact and Palace Sentinels. And as someone who's played a bunch of Boros Monarch, I'm sure you're aware of how powerful the Monarch effect is. Do you think that that's the right call for a deck like this?
Oh, I'm aware. Let me take a look at this real fast. I think in this case, yes, because Guardian of the Guild Pact both protects and takes away the crown extremely easily. You'll notice this deck also has Prismatic Strands, which the other deck did not have, as well as a lot more main deck removal. So this deck it is less on the utility creatures plan, although it's still definitely there, and is acting more of a I want to become the Monarch and then keep that crown. For example, it only has one copy of Crypt Rats, whereas it has 2 copies of Pestilence. Maybe in order to help clear the field, and because it combos a little bit better with Guardian of the Guild Pact than Crypt Rats does. So I think this deck is a little bit more in on the Monarch plan, and the Custody Squires also notably are in the sideboard.
Yeah, I did find that interesting. So the Guardian Palace Sentinels combo is pretty good, and also the fact that it's not planning on having this super recursive main deck game plan makes this one, I guess, slightly more aggressively slanted. It's got a lot more low drop creatures in the deck that, you know, Thraben Inspectors are most of the time chumping or maybe trading if you're getting lucky. So it kind of puts up more of an early game and doesn't go quite as high on the curve. And I definitely enjoy that. I'm not 100% sold on the split of 2 Dusk Legion Zealots and 2 Phyrexian Ragers. I don't know if you have feelings about that one way or the other.
It might be a curve consideration. I think that overall Rager is the stronger card, but costing 2 mana might be a consideration this deck needs to make. You'll notice that there's only 4 2-drops that don't pick up a 1-drop, for example. That's not a removal spell. By that I mean there's 4 copies of Core Skyfisher, and then there's 2 copies of Dusk Legion Zealot and 2 copies of Lone Missionary. So maybe the deck builder here more highly values getting those cards into play than casting a removal spell on turn 2, if that makes sense.
It certainly does. So out of these 2 versions, the more recursive Grim Harvesty version and this version that's looking to play sort of a more straight ahead game plan, which of these appeals more to you as a player?
That's tough, Mike. Both of these lists have a lot of have different things going for them. I would say that I'd probably feel more at home playing the Monarch list, but that's not to say that the other list is bad.
Yeah, it definitely they both have their ups and downs. Now, I do want to touch for a second on these mana bases because I don't know if you've been checking them out as we've been going, but
I've been looking.
They vary pretty wildly. The list we're currently looking at has 23 lands, only 12 of which come in untapped.
Yeah, so just to do the rundown, the one that is more in on the Monarch, 2 Barren Moor, 1 Bojuka Bog, 2 Orzhov Basilica, 5 Plains, 2 Radiant Fountains, 4 Scoured Barrens, 2 Secluded Steppes, and 5 Swamps. The other deck has 2 Barren Moors, 4 Orzhov Basilicas, 6 Plains, 4 Scoured Barrens, and 7 Swamps. So the other deck has a little bit more utility, even though they actually have the same number of lands. And what's also kind of interesting to me is in the Monarch deck, more of these lands would have been artifact lands.
Yeah, and I guess not to look too far back into history, but do you remember the Mardu Skyfisher lists?
What a great deck.
So you seem very insincere here, Adrian.
No, I was reminiscing a little. Sorry, I was yawning also. No, that deck was okay. I mean, you and I really, I mean, if we really want to go back, reach back into the old file, these decks are all derivative of the Jeskai or Azorius. We called them kitty decks back then. That were really built around core Skyfisher bouncing stuff. Now we sort of have these two prongs of the deck where Monarch is more important in both of them, but this version of the deck eschews the artifact recursion altogether in favor of some of the more powerful recursion creatures that have come out since then. And I think the black-white decks have to do that a little bit more, and most of them just don't even like neither of these lists even have the artifact package anymore. Yeah, and you and I always said the worst thing about those decks was that they were 3 colors.
Yeah, they were always really, really thinly stretched, and a lot of the cards they had, it was like, oh, well, you know, Muldrifter draws cards, and Perilous Research draws cards, and you can definitely sack your Ichor Wellsprings. And it was all this, like, synergy that kind of led to very minimal payoffs. And I did, back in the day, really enjoy the Mardu lists that ran, like, a small artifact package so that they could play 4 copies of Galvanic Blast, but also some number of Bleak Coven Vampires, which, for those unaware, is 5 mana, 3 black for a 4/4 that when it enters the battlefield, if you have Metalcraft, it drains your opponent for 4 life. And this was pretty big game. I think it's all but been forced out by the fact that it asks a lot more than it returns. But I think seeing sort of how these decks have reconfigure themselves, and also, like, I remember playing the Pestilence and high toughness creatures combo way back, as I mentioned before, and this is definitely a deck that has been around. So I guess what other cards haven't we talked about that could make it their way into lists like this?
Perhaps Mindraker.
Mindraker? All right, so we do have another list here that's another black-white control list.
Adrian insisted we talk about this list.
All right, let's pop this one open, because oh boy, do I not remember most of the cards in this deck. So Adrian, do you want to remind people about the processor mechanic from Battle for Zendikar?
Sure. Which list was it out of these?
I think it's the third one.
Okay.
Or the second, sorry.
Okay, Mike, all right. So there were these cards in Battle for Zendikar where when they entered the battlefield, you put a card opponent owned from exile into the graveyard, and then they did something. Mindraker specifically is 3 and a black for a 3/3. And I think they were also devoid too. And when it enters the battlefield, you may put a card an opponent owns from exile into the graveyard. If you do, each opponent discards a card. So the idea was that you would combo that with cards like Castigate, which exiles, if you remember, does not actually discard. Cards like Mesmeric Fiend, cards like Journey into Nowhere or Oblivion Ring, and you would then Mindraker them out of your opponent's hand and then get some of that hashtag value. So again, it's a core Skyfisher deck, so there's a lot of other cards in it too. Mesmeric Fiend in particular, you could... So I think what you really wanted to do was you wanted to Mesmeric Fiend or Journey to Nowhere something, Mindraker it, and then return the Journey to Nowhere Mesmeric Fiend to your hand so that you could get more cards.
Yeah, so
off your opponent. It was very slow.
Yeah, it was very slow, but it attacked on kind of this specific card advantage engine where you were denying your opponent resources and turning them into further resource denial. And then you also had things like Ruin Processor, which I'm sure no one remembers, but was 7 generic mana for a 7/8, and when you cast it, you may put a card an opponent owns from exile into that player's graveyard if you do gain 5 life. So kind of just topping the curve with this big old fatty. And also running things like Okiba Gang Shinobi, which again lets you recast these things that either have ETBs or on cast effects, while also denying your opponent cards. You've got like Font of Return to make sure that with that Auramancer in the list, you can kind of loop them forever and keep your opponent from ever being able to really kill your stuff. You know, this is one of the few decks where I'm like, I get why you have a main deck Nihil Spellbomb, or two rather.
Or Relic. You could do Relic even.
Well, with Relic, you kind of miss out on like some of the graveyard synergy that's going on here, I think is the deal. Like you've got that Font of Return and Auramancer, and I think this deck kind of fits into this greater theme we've got going on of like black-white control lists, and we felt it was important to touch on, or Adrian felt it was important to touch on. This, even for me, is maybe a step too far in terms of going down the rabbit hole of obscure mechanics, but
look, it's a black-white control deck. We said we were going to talk about black-white control decks, and there you go. This is what I used to think of when someone said a black-white control deck, and it was laughable. You know, these decks aren't good. So the fact that one now is semi-respectable is quite a feat, in my opinion.
So I guess when we're thinking about these lists, one of the things that kind of caught my attention was most of the lists have kind of, I know I've seen this before, but I'm kind of not seeing it in some of the more modern or more recent, I guess, versions of the black-white Pestilence deck. I'm not seeing Stinkweed Imp. And I've definitely seen that in these lists as just kind of a way to both provide an early blocker with pseudo Death Touch, but also to mill yourself into stuff so that those Custody Squires go up in value significantly. What are your thoughts on that?
Can you repeat that? Sorry.
Using Stinkweed Imp as a card advantage, form of card advantage.
Okay, I see. Yes. Sorry, I got a little distracted. I think that Stinkweed Imp is pretty good. It's a blocker that's extremely difficult to get rid of, if nothing else. My only concern in these black-white lists is that do you want to really be dredging in these decks?
I mean, I think the idea of having something to stop early aggression, but if you're on like, I think you'd have to be on like 2 to 3 copies of Custody Squire
in order to really get the value off of it. But I don't know. Dredge is a stupid mechanic, but I don't know if the cards that really break the mechanic are available at common. It makes sense in, say, Tordex, where you have the Tordex thing to actually, like, at will get things out of your graveyard, but it feels so much weaker when that card is a one-time use out of Custody Squire, or a very slow 2-time use off of Custody Squire and Core Skyfisher.
I see what you're getting at here. And I guess that kind of brings me to my next thing. Is this a deck where we want to play Tordex?
Oh my God, Mike, please. So there is that other list is playing 4 copies of
Grim Harvest.
Grim Harvest, thank you. So what if those copies of Grim Harvest were actually 4 copies of Tortured Existence?
Okay, I like where we're going with this. Okay. So if we swap those, I think then you have to run Stinkweed Imp. I think you need something that can dredge, and I think that's probably the best option in these colors for Pauper. And
I think that would improve Stinkweed Imp a lot as well. Sorry, go ahead. Those are the best colors.
I was gonna say I don't think you want to be stretching into a third color in this deck, because as we mentioned before, some of the mana bases are a little bit laborious in terms of actually getting to cast stuff on time. So I don't hate the idea. And then I guess like you'd probably wind up playing some number less of Custody Squire just because you already have the recursion that you kind of need. You can't really recur the Pestilences. Although at that point, again, you're just kind of, why aren't you on Crypt Rats the deck? And then
Yeah. At that point, maybe Crypt Rats would be a little bit better. But that deck has more Crypt Rats anyway. That's 4 copies in the main, so Tortured Existence seems pretty easy.
yeah, and I think
I feel like these might be 2 different decks, though.
Yeah, and that's kind of the issue with the topic of the day. Like, white-black control has never sort of found this solid, cohesive identity where, you know, Delver decks have probably about 10 cards at most different. But,
Right.
you know, these lists are, when it comes down to it, all really, really different. Like, whether it's shaving the Grim Harvest package to add in different non-recursive options, or playing Guardian of the Guild Pact and Monarch, there's actually a pretty decent spread on these things. So, I don't know. I guess... What other things could really be leveraged by a deck like this that is seeking to grind out the game? Because I think things like Corrupt are obviously off the table, like these kind of big black game finishers.
I think we're really looking for decks that... excuse me. I think that what we're looking for in the future are creatures like Custody Squire that abuse the recursion mechanic. I think that will be stronger. The cheaper and better these creatures are, the better the deck will become, because the engine's already strong.
Yeah, the fact that you get to play like one of the only like quote unquote wrath effects at Pauper that's not only a wrath effect but potentially reusable.
Right.
I guess if I'm just gonna throw out stuff and see if it sticks.
Yeah, that's what we're doing.
I guess the main thing that's striking me is the fact that most of these decks are kind of at a loss for a card draw engine outside of a 4-drop. And
you mean the Monarch card?
Yeah, outside of Palace Sentinels, there's not really a lot of early game card draw, and I'm wondering if this deck almost wants, a Night's Whisper or 2 in it.
And I think some of the lists we looked at do have copies of Night's Whispers in them. But my counter argument would be that maybe we should be running more copies of Dusk Legion Zealot in that case, because I think the creature is more important than the spell.
So if you're on Dusk Legion Zealot, though, my only concern is that limits the number of Pestilences you can play, just because that body is so generally weak to that
You're right.
card.
We're back to square one.
Yeah, there's kind of this circular thing where if Dusk Legion Zealot was a 1/2, I feel like it would be a 4 in this list. No questions asked.
What do you think about re-adding in the artifact package? Or is that too low impact?
All right, so if we re-add in the artifact package, that's going to be at least 8 lands, right? And then I guess if we have the Bleak Coven Vampires as a top end.
Oh, I meant really just Prophetic Prism.
Oh, you're thinking just I don't hate Prophetic Prism.
To just draw cards and bounce them back. I guess the only concern is that the Boros lists have 8 of those type of cards because they're also running Glinthawk, and I don't know if this deck has room for Glinthawk.
Okay, so Glinthawk is probably a little bit dicey because 2 is still a relatively low toughness, but what if... I'm trying to think of the other bounce selling to your hand effects, and the only one I'm coming up with that isn't Glinthawk is the bear from Kaladesh, whose name is not going to come to me. It's 1 and a white for a 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, you may return a permanent you control to its owner's hand.
I know what you're talking about.
But
again, this also feels like a slightly different deck than I guess the one we're talking about. You're right, though. I think one of the big problems, like you said, is that Black-White Control really doesn't have its own identity outside of currently it's a Pestilence deck, which is maybe fine, but yeah.
All right, here I'm gonna toss something real weird at you. So we talked about Metalcraft, right?
Yeah.
Do you remember Rusted Relic?
Dude, I actually like that card a lot. I used to play it in Affinity. What are you thinking?
So Rusted Relic is, for those who aren't aware, it's a 4-mana artifact that does nothing until you hit Metalcraft. And when you have Metalcraft, it's a 5/5 golem.
I used to play it to combat Gurmag Anglers.
Oh, okay, yeah. I was honestly just thinking about it as a creature that is a undercosted 5/5. And now that you've actually mentioned Gurmag Angler, why couldn't these decks run that as well? Like, they're going to get to a point in the game where there's a bunch of stuff in the bin. It'll be easy to cast the first time, and these decks are focused on a game plan that gets really grindy. They can just at some point start hard casting these for full cost if they can keep the board clean. So,
not a bad idea.
Yeah, I was gonna say, is that really the worst idea out there? And I don't know, that seems like something that even as like a 1 or 2 of could potentially put in a ton of work. And I'm not a big fan. Is there anything to be explored with the high toughness creatures like the walls? Because I really don't like that as a plan personally.
No, and I know that there's like a cute combo with Wall of Hope. Is that the card, the one where it's dealt damage in game life? I don't like that either. I think that rout's a little too cute. Honestly, I really think, the more I think about it, I really think that this creature recursion list or this monarch list are really the two best. Like, these people, I don't know. I guess maybe I might be giving them a lot of credit here, but it seems like those are really two of the best lists that we've seen or really talked about. And I feel like our replacements aren't really as good as them, if that makes sense.
That's fair. I do like the idea of slotting some amount of prophetic prisms in, though, especially because you are a deck that's very color intensive when it comes to effects like Crypt Rats or Pestilence.
Or Pestilence, yeah. So actually, that I do like that as well. You know, I forgot that Pestilence only activates off black mana for some reason. But yeah, that could definitely help you in a key turn get the amount of black mana that you need.
Yeah, it definitely just feels like there's something to be had there in terms of helping draw you cards in the early game, helping you fix your mana, because you've played a ton of Boros Monarch. How important is that card just in terms of like making sure that you can hit all your land drops and draw into stuff?
I think it's the best 2-drop in the deck.
There you go. You heard it here first, folks. Best 2-drop in the deck.
Best 2-drop in the deck. Mic drop.
All right. So
show's over.
So with this deck, where do you see kind of the future of it heading? Like, do you think that this is a deck that, and I hate to bring this up because I know people are going to be upset in the comments, if we saw a banning in Pauper of a blue cantrip, does this deck stock go up or down?
I think definitely up.
Now is that just the fact that blue decks are probably favorable against this, or the fact that this will prey upon decks that would get better as a result of that change?
I think it's because blue decks are just far and away some of the best decks in the format. And like this deck, I'm sure is a great matchup against elves. Maybe it has some problems against other grindy, like super duper grindy decks, because Pestilence might not be as great in those matchups. But I think just if you can displace blue, it's going to sort of be a free-for-all for what's the next best thing.
I think that's fair. All right, so shifting gears a little bit from
as riveting as this has been, Mike.
As riveting and interesting as this has been, we did want to briefly talk about the results from Rags to Riches 20, and you had brought this up to us, brought this up to me before the show.
Yeah, and it's cool. There's a lot of stock lists in the top 8, but the winner of the whole tournament was Travis, and forgive me, Travis, I'm probably going to say this wrong if you listen, Hoberlaw, and he won with a deck that is Grixis Flicker. So it's a Grixis control deck. We've got 4 copies Ash Barrens, 1 copy Bloodfell Caves, 1 copy Bajuka Bog, 3 copies Deemer Aqueduct, 7 snow-covered islands, 2 snow-covered mountains, 1 snow-covered swamp, 4 Swiftwater Cliffs. In our creature base, we have 2 copies Archaeomancer, 4 copies Augur of Bolus, 4 copies Moldrifter, 1 copy Stormbound Geist. In our instants and sorceries, we got 24 of those. We've got 1 comparative analysis, which is a 4-mana instant. Target player draws 2 cards, but it has a surge cost of 2 and a blue. 4 copies Devour Flesh, 4 copies Counter Spell, 1 copy Devour Flesh, 1 copy like Trickery, 1 copy Exclude, 1 copy Flame Slash, 1 copy Ghostly Flicker, 3 Lightning Bolts, 2 Mystical Teachings, Preordain, Pyroblast, Soul Manipulation, and Terminate. So really, it's a Teachings deck with a Ghostly Flicker package, it feels like.
Yeah, and this is kind of a weird list, and I know Adrian kind of ran through all this, but I'm kind of curious about your thoughts on this, because this is not what I expect when I hear the word flicker, because this is obviously, it's not like having some sort of infinite combo, or at least, you know, when I think flicker, I think more of like the rat flicker deck that tries to lock the opponent out of ever drawing a new card. And this is basically a grindy control deck that is only barely touching black for a handful of cards. And I don't know, looking at the rest of the top 8 for reference, so it's this Grixis Flicker deck, and then we have Elves, Boros Monarch, Elves, Boros Monarch, Elves, Mono Blue Delver, Mono Blue Delver. So
poor Delver decks didn't stand a chance. One of those Mono Blue Delver lists, I mean, so the decks are all kind of interesting. I also missed out, sorry, that on the Grixis Flicker list, there was also 2 copies Serrated Arrows, which is awesome with Ghostly Flicker, and I can see why it was super good against this field. The Elves list is a little interesting. I don't see actually a whole big lot to talk about here. The first deck by Coleman Falk has all snow-covered basics, which you'll see a lot during this tournament, it feels like. And then the Boros list is running the Faithless Looting version, which is kind of cool. I keep meaning to try that out. It's got Circular Protection Green, which we talked about as being the worst Circular Protection. And, of course, because it's Rags to Riches, they have Red Elemental Blast on their sideboard.
Yeah, which is, you know, neither here nor there, but...
The next Elves list, the second one, runs no islands. The first one had 1 island and Distant Melody. This one is all in on Lead the Stampede, so kind of interesting there. The next Scott Thiener's Boros Monarch list has the Faithless Looting in it as well. These lists look pretty much the same, actually. I mean, except that one of them is Pyroblast, one is Red Elemental Blast.
I mean, it is a small tournament. These people could have practiced together.
That's true. And then the final Elves list does run back the Distant Melodies. It has 1 copy of Harsh Sustenance in the sideboard, which is kind of cool.
What is that the white-black card?
Yeah, deal X damage to any target, and you gain X life, where X is the number of creatures you control.
Well, that's actually kind of interesting. I'm not sure why I would play that over, say, like Mob Justice, but I guess it does gain you the life. It just seems much harder to cast in this deck.
And the first Mono Blue Delver list by Garrett DeBruin is running 3 copies of Opt, which is, again, just interesting. 4 copies Daze. And then the other Mono Blue Delver list by Maxwell Forlini has no copies of Opt, but is instead running 3 copies of Mutagenic Growth.
Now, I don't want to out myself as an old person here, but why are the kids running Opt these days? That seems...
I don't know. Honestly, don't know. He's running 1 less Ninja the Deep Hours and 1 less Spire Golem than the full 4. And I think that the last Opt would have been maybe a Deprive in earlier days. So I'm honestly unsure.
It seems like a little bit of a bizarre choice, especially since I'm looking at the list and it does already max out on Ponder and Preordains. So I don't... Mono Blue Delver is not exactly a deck that's kind of, you know, strapped for card draw. It just seems like a bit of an interesting call. Maybe the fact that it is an instant and you can leave mana up and cast this on your opponent's end step if you don't counter anything, but that seems really minimal in terms of actual value you're going to get out of this. I guess this is another one where you could... No, you can't even cast this during your upkeep to make sure you flip Delver because you draw the thing. I legitimately don't know.
It's unusual, but clearly got them to the top 8. So
Yeah, it's I I could almost see, like, I don't know, like if you had to play Brainstorm in this, because Opt can technically get you through 2 cards, but that just doesn't seem right to me. I don't know. Is there anything was there anything super spicy about this last mono blue list, or is it just pretty much stock?
I mean, it's got the 3 copies of mutagenic growth.
This is the version that cuts the Spire Golems. Okay.
Oh, I didn't even notice that.
Yeah, this is the much more aggressively slanted one where you're trading in your golems for mutagenics.
Oh, and the other deck doesn't have any copies of Augur Bolus. I missed that too.
Yeah, it's you'll pardon us, folks. MTG Top 8, while a wonderful website, does not have the world's greatest interface for just staring at cards and figuring out what they are. But all right, so we're looking at this top 8, and most of these are pretty stock lists. None of these are doing anything that's kind of that revolutionary, except that Grixis Flicker list. And Travis, I actually recognize his name from previous Rags to Riches, has come with all sorts of spicy control decks. So is this just a case of a control player putting together a pile of cards that they like and going, I can probably do pretty well with this? Or is there something secret here? Do you think this deck is legitimately great?
No, I think the pile is probably pretty good, because I think control is in a kind of a bad spot right now in the format, just as a whole. Sure, that's not to say that you can't 5-0 or win a tournament, but when you're playing against decks like Blue Red Delver, which is notably absent from this top 8, decks like Boros Monarch, and even decks like Elves, it seems very hard to win. So props to Travis for taking it all the way.
Yeah, and I guess with this list, I also have to like question the fact. Yeah, there's the fact that it's running teachings and then like not running. I guess it's got the 1 electrickery. I don't know. It just seems like this is gonna have some pretty rough matchups. Like, I have no idea how this actually beats Stompy, outside of just like having a good removal heavy hand that interacts favorably with them. It just seems like that matchup's going to be real rough. Like, unless you have like 2 or 3 removal spells, I just worry that you could get run over way too quickly. And then the sideboard kind of, I guess the Crypt Incursions do help, but I don't know. This seems like a very deep meta call that maybe there's something I'm not aware of, where this list in the hands of a good pilot can take down a tournament like this. But I'm not gonna recommend folks hurry out to pick this one up for Mitgo. This seems like one of those very, very meta dependent sort of things.
Yeah.
Now I will say, I do want to have a discussion with you. What are your feelings on Luxa River Shrine?
I don't know what that card does, Mike. Let's
So
look it up.
Luxa River Shrine is 3 generic mana for an artifact. 1 and tap, you gain 1 life. Put a brick counter on Luxa River Shrine.
A brick counter.
Yes, and then it also has an ability tap. You gain 2 life. Activate this ability only if there are 3 or more brick counters on Luxa River Shrine. How do you feel about this as tech for burn?
It seems awful, dude. It seems so slow. 3 mana.
So it effectively earliest could probably come online turn 6.
Oh yeah, turn 6 versus burn seems great, dude.
It seems as though you're potentially being mildly sarcastic about this, Adrian.
I'm being a little facetious. Yeah, I think that's so slow. Is this card really good against burn?
I mean, that's the only thing I can think of it. Like,
it plays burn plays Smash to Smithereens.
Like, I just can't imagine what other matchup this would possibly come in for. Like, Stompy, like, do you realistically think that a control deck can last to turn 7 against Stompy?
Yeah, but I don't think they can against burn either. I'm pretty confused by this card also.
I don't know. This is, Again, perhaps the result of someone making a very, very specific meta call, but I don't think this card is good. Just kind of across the board. But again,
but you wanted my take on it.
I did want your take on it. Again, congratulations, Travis. You managed to win this tournament with something that I wouldn't understand from the get-go how to play. So props where props are due. I guess unless there's anything else you want to talk about with regards to either black-white control or the top 8 of Rags to Riches, I think we can sort of call this episode then.
Sure. Call it like it's hot. Thanks for joining us today, everyone. This podcast is brought to you by the support of our patrons, including Forrest Bump. Please consider supporting us if you like the show. Check those videos in the description of this podcast for details on where to find us. We'd like to remind you, if listening to this on a platform with reviews, they're always appreciated because they boost our visibility. If you've got a deck list or idea for a topic, you can contact us either via our website or by emailing us directly at colorcommentary@gmail.com. Special thanks to Pat's Games and L and JP Comics. So next week, this is Adrian and Mike, and we are signing off for Color Commentary.